The easiest way to discover how someone sees the world is to watch how they treat a person they believe has no power. The parking lot outside the Brookhaven Police Department was busy that Thursday afternoon. Patrol vehicles came and went through the security gate. Officers crossed the lot carrying paperwork and coffee cups. Citizens entered and exited the front lobby beneath the bright Georgia sun. To everyone passing through, it looked like an ordinary day. But before the afternoon was over, one officer would learn a lesson he would never forget. Rachel Bennett stepped out of a silver sedan parked near the visitor section and adjusted the strap of her handbag. In one hand, she carried a large sealed envelope. She moved with quiet confidence, dressed in a navy blazer and simple business attire that drew little attention. Her destination was the main entrance of the station. She had made this trip many times before. Today was supposed to be quick. Deliver the documents. Meet her husband. Leave for dinner. Nothing complicated. Nothing dramatic. Then Officer Mark Dalton noticed her. Mark was standing near the front entrance speaking with another officer when his attention shifted toward Rachel. Something about her presence immediately triggered assumptions in his mind. Instead of continuing his conversation, he stepped away and moved toward her path. Rachel noticed him approaching and slowed politely. Mark stopped several feet in front of her. His expression carried the confidence of someone who believed he already understood the situation. "Can I help you with something?" he asked. The question sounded professional on the surface, but the tone beneath it felt different. Rachel smiled politely. "I am here to drop something off." Mark glanced at the envelope. Then he glanced back at her. "Drop something off for who?" Rachel looked toward the station entrance. "Someone inside." The answer should have ended the conversation. Instead, it seemed to encourage him. Around them, officers walked across the lot. A patrol vehicle rolled through the gate. The sounds of traffic drifted from the nearby street. Yet Mark remained focused on Rachel. "You are going to need to be more specific than that," he said. Rachel maintained the same calm expression. "I have an appointment." Mark folded his arms. "With who?" Rachel hesitated briefly. Not because she was nervous, because she was surprised by how interested he seemed. "My husband," she answered. The response only strengthened Mark's confidence. He interpreted her patience as uncertainty. He interpreted her politeness as weakness. Imagine standing outside a police station while someone decides who you are before learning a single fact about you. Imagine realizing that no matter what answer you give, the conclusion has already been made. That was Rachel's reality. Mark took another step closer. "People cannot just walk in and out of here whenever they want." Rachel glanced at the station doors and then back at him. "I understand." Her calmness seemed to frustrate him. Nearby, two officers exiting the building briefly looked in their direction before continuing on. Rachel adjusted her grip on the envelope and checked the time on her phone. 3:37 in the afternoon. She was already running late. Mark noticed the phone and shook his head. "In a hurry?" he asked. Rachel slipped the phone back into her purse and smiled politely. "A little." Mark smirked. "Well, that depends on me." 20 minutes later, he would wish he had never said those words. Rachel Bennett remained standing near the entrance of the Brookhaven Police Department while Officer Mark Dalton seemed determined to stretch a simple interaction into something much larger. Around them, officers moved in and out of the building carrying files, radios, and coffee cups. The afternoon sun reflected from patrol vehicle windshields parked across the lot. To everyone else, it was another ordinary day at the station. To Rachel, it was becoming an unnecessary delay. Mark glanced at the sealed envelope in her hands again. The more polite she remained, the more suspicious he seemed to become. "You said you have an appointment," he said. "What kind of appointment?" Rachel adjusted her grip on the envelope. "A personal one." Mark shook his head slowly. "That is not really an answer." Rachel smiled politely. "It is the only answer I need to give." The response was calm, respectful, yet something about it appeared to frustrate him. He seemed to expect explanations, apologies, or nervousness. Instead, Rachel stood quietly beneath the warm Georgia sunlight, as though she had all the time in the world. In reality, she did not. Her phone vibrated inside her purse again. Another message. Then another. She ignored both. Across town, people were already gathering. A meeting was scheduled. Dinner plans had been arranged. Several important conversations were waiting to happen. None of that mattered to Mark because none of that fit into the assumptions he had already formed. Imagine meeting someone for less than 5 minutes and deciding you know their entire story. Imagine becoming so confident in that judgment that every new fact feels like an inconvenience. That was exactly what was happening. Mark took another look toward the station entrance and then back at Rachel. You know, people usually cooperate when they come here. Rachel tilted her head slightly. I have been cooperating. The answer was impossible to argue with, yet Mark still seemed dissatisfied. Nearby, two detectives exited the building and headed toward an unmarked vehicle. One of them briefly glanced toward Rachel before continuing on. The moment lasted only seconds, but Rachel noticed it immediately. Mark did not. The parking lot continued buzzing with activity. Engine started. Car doors closed. Radios crackled in the distance. Yet the conversation remained frozen in place. Rachel checked the time on her phone. 3:42. 5 more minutes had disappeared. Mark noticed the movement. You seem anxious to get somewhere. Rachel slipped the phone back into her purse. I am expected somewhere. Important? Mark asked. Rachel smiled faintly. Very. The answer lingered in the air. For a brief moment, uncertainty crossed his face. Then it vanished. Confidence returned. Assumptions returned. The pattern repeated itself. A black SUV rolled slowly past the station entrance before continuing down the street. Rachel noticed it. Her expression remained unchanged. Mark never even looked in its direction. Another message appeared on her phone. This one made her smile. It was a small smile, almost invisible, yet it was enough. Something amusing? Mark asked. Rachel looked toward the station doors. Not amusing, she replied. Just familiar. Somewhere inside the building, a door opened. A voice called out to someone in the hallway. And without realizing it, Officer Mark Dalton was only minutes away from discovering exactly why Rachel Bennett had been so calm from the very beginning. Rachel Bennett remained standing near the entrance while the afternoon continued unfolding around her. The parking lot of the Brookhaven Police Department was busy enough that most people never noticed the conversation taking place beside the visitor walkway. Officers came and went. Civilian employees crossed the lot carrying folders and laptops. Patrol vehicles rolled through the security gate at regular intervals. Yet despite all the activity, Officer Mark Dalton seemed completely focused on proving a point. The longer Rachel remained calm, the more determined he became. It was a strange pattern, one Rachel had seen before. Some people become uncomfortable when their assumptions fail to produce the reaction they expected. Mark appeared to be one of those people. Her phone vibrated again. This time the screen displayed a familiar name. She looked at it for a moment before silencing the call. Mark immediately noticed. Busy afternoon? He asked. Rachel smiled politely. Something like that. He nodded as though her answer confirmed a theory he had already formed. Across the parking lot, a patrol officer exiting the station glanced toward Rachel and paused for half a second. The officer seemed to recognize her. Then he continued walking without saying anything. Rachel noticed the reaction. Mark did not. The difference mattered. Imagine standing in a place where several people know exactly who you are while the one person questioning you knows the least. That was the reality unfolding beneath the warm Georgia sunlight. Rachel adjusted the envelope in her hands and looked toward the station doors. She had promised she would arrive before the meeting began. At this point, she was already late. Yet she showed no frustration, no anger, no urgency. Her confidence came from certainty. She knew the delay would not last forever. Mark folded his arms and looked toward the entrance. You seem pretty comfortable for someone being kept waiting. Rachel met his eyes. I have learned that getting upset rarely improves a situation. The answer caught him off guard. Not because it was disrespectful, because it was true. For a brief moment, he seemed unsure how to respond. Then his confidence returned. A black SUV slowly passed the front of the station once again. This time it moved more slowly than before. Rachel noticed it immediately. Her expression softened almost imperceptibly. Mark finally noticed the vehicle as well, but only long enough to dismiss it. To him, it was just another SUV. To Rachel, it was a sign that someone was looking for her. Nearby, two administrative employees exited the building carrying boxes. One of them glanced at Rachel and whispered something to the other. Both immediately looked toward the station entrance. Again, Rachel noticed. Again, Mark did not. The pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. People around the station were beginning to recognize that Rachel belonged there. The only person still treating her like an outsider was the man standing directly in front of her. Her phone lit up again. This time a text message appeared. Rachel read it and smiled. "Everything all right?" Mark asked. "Everything is fine," she replied. And for the first time since the conversation began, she sounded completely certain. Because somewhere inside the building, someone had just realized she was still outside. And the moment that person came through those doors, everything was about to change. The moment inside the station shifted long before Officer Mark Dalton realized it. Rachel Bennett stood quietly near the entrance, holding the sealed envelope with the same patience she had displayed from the beginning. Around her, the rhythm of the Brookhaven Police Department continued. Phones rang. Officers crossed the lobby. Patrol units entered and exited the parking lot. Yet beneath that ordinary activity, something subtle had changed. More people were noticing Rachel. More importantly, they seemed surprised that she was still standing outside. The station doors opened, and a lieutenant stepped into the afternoon sunlight carrying a stack of reports. He looked toward the parking lot, then toward Rachel. For a brief second, confusion crossed his face. He appeared ready to say something before noticing Mark standing nearby. Instead, he simply nodded respectfully toward Rachel and continued on his way. The interaction lasted only a moment, but Rachel noticed it. Mark noticed it as well. For the first time that afternoon, a question entered his mind. Why did people keep reacting to her that way? Rachel checked her phone again. A new message appeared. This one made her smile more noticeably than before. She typed a short response and slipped the phone back into her purse. Mark folded his arms. "You seem very confident for someone waiting outside a building they cannot enter." Rachel looked at the station entrance and then back at him. "I never said I could not enter." The answer caught him off guard. Around them, a patrol vehicle rolled through the gate and parked near the rear lot. Two officers stepped out and headed toward the building. One of them recognized Rachel immediately. His eyes widened slightly before he glanced toward Mark. Then he quickly continued walking. Again, the pattern repeated itself. People recognized her. People seemed surprised she was outside. Yet nobody openly explained why. Imagine watching a puzzle come together one piece at a time while refusing to look at the picture on the box. That was Mark's situation. Every clue was visible. He simply was not putting them together. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the concrete walkway leading to the station doors. Rachel remained calm, but she was becoming increasingly aware of the time. The meeting inside had already started. Several people were waiting. One person in particular was probably wondering why she had not arrived. The station doors opened again. This time, a detective hurried outside holding a folder. He stopped the moment he saw Rachel. "There you are," he said before quickly catching himself. His eyes shifted toward Mark. The detective looked confused, then concerned. "Everything okay?" Rachel smiled politely. "Everything is fine." The detective hesitated. It was clear he wanted to say more. Instead, he nodded and returned inside. Mark watched him go. The uncertainty growing inside him became harder to ignore. Something was happening. Something he did not understand. Then Rachel's phone rang again. She looked at the screen and answered immediately. Her expression softened. "Hi," she said. She listened for several seconds before smiling. "Yes, I am still outside." A pause followed. Then Rachel glanced toward the station entrance. "I think you should come get me." The call ended. Rachel slipped the phone into her purse and looked toward the building. For the first time all afternoon, she seemed completely certain that the waiting was over. And somewhere inside the Brookhaven Police Department, a man who had been expecting her arrival was already heading for the door. The atmosphere outside the Brookhaven Police Department changed almost immediately after Rachel Bennett ended the call. She did not explain who she had spoken to. She did not make a dramatic announcement. She simply slipped her phone back into her purse and waited. That quiet confidence seemed to unsettle Officer Mark Dalton more than any argument could have. Throughout the afternoon, he had been operating from certainty. Now that certainty was beginning to disappear, the station doors opened again. This time, several people emerged in quick succession. A sergeant crossed the parking lot carrying a folder. Two detectives followed behind him. A civilian administrator stepped outside and scanned the visitor area before noticing Rachel. The administrator immediately changed direction and headed toward her. The reaction was impossible to miss. Mark watched carefully. The administrator approached Rachel with a smile that carried genuine relief. "We have been wondering where you were," she said. Rachel laughed softly. "I ran into a delay." The administrator glanced toward Mark and then back toward Rachel. For a brief moment, confusion crossed her face. It was clear she expected Rachel to already be inside the building. Around them, the afternoon continued. Patrol vehicles entered and exited the lot. Radios crackled. Officers spoke into microphones while walking between buildings. Yet the focus of the scene seemed to be narrowing. More people were noticing Rachel. More people seemed surprised she was still standing outside. Mark tried to ignore the growing pattern. Imagine spending an hour convinced you understand a situation, only to watch evidence appear that suggests the opposite. Imagine realizing that everyone around you may know something you do not. That was exactly what was happening. Rachel remained calm. She adjusted the envelope in her hands and glanced toward the entrance again. The meeting she was supposed to attend had already started, yet she showed no irritation. If anything, she appeared more relaxed than before. The certainty she carried was becoming impossible to overlook. Another black SUV rolled slowly into the parking lot and parked near the administrative entrance. A man in a suit stepped out and immediately looked toward Rachel. The moment he spotted her, he smiled and raised a hand in greeting. Rachel returned the gesture. Mark noticed the interaction. The question forming in his mind grew larger. Who exactly was she? The administrator standing beside Rachel checked her watch. "Everyone is waiting upstairs," she said. Rachel nodded. "I know. I should be there soon." The answer sounded simple, but the words "everyone is waiting" lingered in Mark's thoughts. People inside the station were waiting for her, not the other way around. The realization felt important. Nearby, a detective exiting the building slowed as he passed. "Good to see you, Rachel," he said. "He has been asking about you all afternoon." Rachel smiled. "I figured." The detective laughed and continued toward the parking lot. Mark watched him leave. Another clue. Another piece of a puzzle he still could not solve. Then, from inside the station, the front doors opened once more. This time, the reaction around Rachel was immediate. Conversations paused. Several people turned toward the entrance. Even the administrator beside her smiled knowingly. Rachel looked up, and for the first time all afternoon, she seemed certain that the person she had been waiting for had finally arrived. The person who stepped through the front doors did not rush. He did not need to. The moment he appeared, the atmosphere around the entrance shifted in a way that was impossible to miss. Conversations paused. Officers walking across the parking lot slowed slightly. Even people who had been focused on entirely different tasks seemed to notice him immediately. Rachel Bennett smiled the moment she saw him. It was the first genuine smile she had shown all afternoon. Officer Mark Dalton watched carefully. He had spent the last hour trying to understand why so many people seemed to recognize Rachel. Now he finally sensed that the answer was approaching. The man walked down the front steps carrying a folder under one arm. He was dressed professionally but without any obvious display of rank. Yet the respect surrounding him was unmistakable. A lieutenant passing nearby nodded. A detective briefly stopped to speak with him. The station administrator standing beside Rachel immediately stepped aside to give him room. The man's attention, however, remained fixed on Rachel. "There you are," he said with a smile. "I have been looking for you everywhere." Rachel laughed softly. "I was trying to get inside." The answer sounded simple, but several people nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. Mark felt his stomach tighten slightly. The man looked at the envelope in Rachel's hands. "You brought the documents?" Rachel nodded and handed it to him. "Exactly where you asked me to." Their interaction was effortless, familiar, comfortable, the kind shared by people who trusted each other completely. Imagine watching two people speak and realizing they belong to the same world while you have been standing outside it the entire time. That was exactly how Mark felt. Throughout the afternoon, he had assumed he understood the situation. Now he was beginning to realize he understood almost nothing. The man turned toward the station entrance and briefly acknowledged several officers by name before looking back at Rachel. "The meeting cannot start without you," he said. "Everyone is waiting upstairs." Rachel glanced at her watch. "Then I am officially late." The man smiled. "Only because somebody kept you out here." The comment was lighthearted, but it landed heavily. Nearby, the station administrator suddenly became very interested in a clipboard. A detective looked away. Mark remained silent. For the first time all afternoon, he had no idea what to say. The late afternoon sunlight cast long shadows across the parking lot. Patrol vehicles continued moving through the gate. Life at the station carried on, yet the focus of the entire scene seemed centered on the man standing beside Rachel. He accepted the envelope, thanked her, and then gently touched her shoulder. It was a small gesture, Familiar. Natural. Rachel smiled again. Then the man finally looked directly at Mark. Not with anger. Not with hostility. Simply with curiosity. "Everything all right out here?" he asked. The question sounded harmless. Yet something about it made several people nearby stop what they were doing. Rachel remained calm. Mark remained silent. And standing beneath the warm Georgia sun outside the Brookhaven Police Department, the final piece of the puzzle was only moments away from falling into place. For several long seconds, nobody answered the question. The late afternoon sun illuminated the front entrance of the Brookhaven Police Department, casting golden light across the parking lot and the rows of patrol vehicles parked nearby. Rachel Bennett stood calmly beside the man who had just stepped out of the station. Officer Mark Dalton remained frozen in place. The uncertainty that had been growing inside him all afternoon had finally become impossible to ignore. The man looked from Rachel to Mark and then back again. "Rachel," he asked gently, "is everything okay?" Rachel nodded. "Everything is fine. There was just some confusion about why I was here." The answer was simple, but several people nearby suddenly became very interested in the conversation. A detective standing near the entrance stopped walking. The station administrator quietly lowered her clipboard. Even a patrol officer crossing the lot slowed his pace. The man beside Rachel gave a small nod. Then he turned fully toward Mark. "I am Daniel Bennett," he said. The name alone seemed to affect several people nearby. Mark recognized it immediately, though he could not place it at first. Then the realization arrived. Daniel Bennett was not just another visitor. He was the deputy chief overseeing professional standards and internal accountability reviews across the department. The recognition hit Mark like a sudden flash of light. Throughout the afternoon, he had been questioning Rachel, delaying Rachel, and making assumptions about Rachel without realizing she was married to one of the most respected leaders in the entire department. Yet what surprised him most was not Daniel's position. It was the way Daniel looked at Rachel. There was genuine respect there. Genuine trust. The kind that cannot be created by titles or authority. Imagine spending an hour trying to determine whether someone belongs somewhere, only to discover they are connected to the very people who helped shape that place. Imagine realizing that everyone else seemed to know what you did not. That was exactly what Mark was experiencing. Daniel glanced toward the sealed envelope. "Those are the briefing documents." Rachel nodded. "The updated files you requested." Daniel smiled. "Good. The meeting upstairs has been waiting on those." Another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Rachel had never been trying to gain access. She had already belonged there. She had arrived to deliver important materials directly connected to the meeting taking place inside the station. Several officers exchanged quiet looks. The story everyone thought they understood had completely changed. Daniel placed a hand lightly on Rachel's shoulder and smiled. "I should have come outside sooner." Rachel laughed softly. "I told you I could handle it." The exchange was warm and familiar. Mark watched in silence. Earlier that afternoon, he believed he had been evaluating Rachel. Now he understood something uncomfortable. The entire time, his own behavior had been the thing revealing itself. Daniel looked toward him once more. His expression remained professional, calm, respectful. There was no anger, no confrontation. Somehow that made the moment even more powerful. Because the lesson had never been about power. It had never been about titles. It had never been about who Rachel was married to. It was about how a person chooses to treat someone before knowing any of those things. And standing outside the station beneath the fading Georgia sunlight, Officer Mark Dalton finally understood exactly what that meant. The silence that followed the introduction lingered longer than anyone expected. Not because Daniel Bennett had raised his voice. Not because he had demanded anything. The silence existed because the truth had finally arrived, and suddenly everyone could see the afternoon differently. Rachel Bennett stood beside her husband holding the now-delivered envelope, while officers and staff members continued moving around the station. Yet the energy around the entrance had changed. People who had only casually observed the situation earlier were now replaying it in their minds. They remembered the questions, the assumptions, the delay, the certainty, and they were beginning to view all of it through a different lens. Daniel remained professional. He thanked Rachel for bringing the documents and briefly reviewed the contents of the envelope before handing it to one of the detectives waiting nearby. "Make sure these are included in the briefing package," he said. The detective nodded immediately and headed back inside. Rachel checked the time. 4:12 in the afternoon. The meeting upstairs was already running behind schedule. Daniel smiled. We should probably get moving. Rachel nodded. Yet before either of them turned toward the entrance, another detail changed the atmosphere once again. A lieutenant approached Daniel carrying a tablet. The security review team already pulled the front entrance footage, he said quietly. Everything from the visitor area is archived. The statement sounded routine, administrative, standard procedure. Yet Officer Mark Dalton immediately understood what it meant. Modern police facilities document everything. Security cameras, entry logs, visitor records, radio traffic, timestamps. None of it existed to target anyone. It existed to preserve facts. Daniel simply nodded. Good, he said. Keep everything in the normal file. Normal file. The phrase mattered. There was no anger, no special order, no demand, just a routine instruction to preserve information exactly as it happened. Imagine realizing that the strongest form of accountability is often the simplest. Not punishment, not confrontation, just an accurate record of the truth. That realization settled heavily over the parking lot. Rachel noticed the expression on Mark's face. Earlier in the afternoon, he had seemed completely certain of every decision he made. Now he appeared reflective, thoughtful. The confidence that once drove the conversation had been replaced by something else. Awareness. Nearby, several officers exchanged quiet glances before returning to their work. Nobody celebrated. Nobody mocked him. That somehow made the lesson more powerful. Daniel adjusted the folder under his arm and looked toward the station entrance. Ready? He asked Rachel. She smiled. I have been ready for almost an hour. The people nearby laughed softly. Even Daniel shook his head. Fair point. The moment felt human, warm, normal. Yet beneath it remained a truth nobody could ignore. Respect should never depend on discovering someone's connections. It should exist before any introductions happen. As Daniel and Rachel began walking toward the building, Mark watched them go. The afternoon sun reflected across the station windows. Patrol vehicles continued entering and leaving the lot. Life moved forward exactly as it always had. But somewhere inside the Brookhaven Police Department, records were being preserved, timelines were being documented, and facts were being recorded. Not because Rachel was married to Daniel Bennett, because facts matter. And for the first time that day, Officer Mark Dalton fully understood the difference between authority and character. As the afternoon slowly turned toward evening, the Brookhaven Police Department returned to its normal rhythm. Officers moved between offices. Radios carried routine updates. Patrol vehicles rolled through the gates beneath the fading Georgia sunlight. On the surface, everything looked exactly the same. Yet for the people who had witnessed the events outside the station, something had changed. Rachel Bennett and Daniel Bennett eventually emerged from the meeting nearly 2 hours later. The envelope Rachel had carried that afternoon now sat inside a secure file room along with the materials discussed during the briefing. Business had been completed. Responsibilities had been handled. Life was moving forward. Together, they stepped through the station doors and into the warm glow of early evening. The parking lot was quieter now. Long shadows stretched across the pavement. The sky above Atlanta had begun shifting from blue to orange. Rachel paused near the entrance and looked across the lot. It was the same place where she had spent nearly an hour waiting. The same place where assumptions had been made before questions were asked. The same place where character had revealed itself without anyone realizing it. Daniel noticed her expression. Everything all right? He asked. Rachel smiled softly. Everything is fine. And she meant it. Because despite everything that happened, she had learned something important. The truth does not always need to defend itself. Sometimes it simply waits. Across the lot, Officer Mark Dalton stood beside his patrol vehicle reviewing paperwork before the start of another assignment. He looked up briefly and saw Rachel and Daniel walking toward their car. For a moment, their eyes met. There was no hostility, no confrontation, no anger, just understanding. Mark nodded respectfully. Rachel returned the gesture. The exchange lasted only seconds, yet it carried more meaning than the entire conversation they had shared earlier that afternoon. Imagine realizing that the person you underestimated taught you a lesson without ever raising their voice. Imagine understanding that respect is not something earned through titles, influence, or connections. It is something every person deserves from the very beginning. That realization remained with Mark long after Rachel and Daniel left the station. Nearby, officers continued their duties. Citizens entered and exited the building. The city moved forward exactly as it always does. Yet somewhere inside the department, records had been preserved. Timelines had been documented. Procedures had been followed. Not because someone demanded special treatment. Because accountability is most powerful when it applies equally to everyone. Rachel placed her purse inside the car and looked once more toward the station. Daniel opened the passenger door for her with a smile. Together they drove away beneath the evening sky, disappearing into the flow of Atlanta traffic. Behind them, the lights of the station began to glow against the darkening horizon. The day was over. The lesson remained. A uniform can create authority. A position can create influence. A family name can open doors. But none of those things reveal who a person truly is. Only their choices can do that. And on that quiet evening outside the Brookhaven Police Department, one man discovered that character is measured long before anyone learns who you know, who you love, or who you are married to.